Shivani Sutaria of Shivani Sutaria Law Offices. She's an employment law attorney and a workplace investigator. She started her own firm in 2014, and she focuses on conducting external workplace investigations, providing advice and counsel to employers, and presenting trainings to employees and employers. So she's going to tell us all about the ABCs of AB5, which is the new contractor law in California. Please stay muted. You can type your questions into the chat, and Shivani will go through her presentation and have some time for Q&A. Thank you very much. Here you go, Shivani.
All right. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you for inviting me to come do this. I am going to talk about AB5, which is still what we call the new independent contractor law in its bill form, but it is actual statute now in the labor code. It became law back in October of 2019 and went into effect on January 1st, 2020. And this was the biggest deal in employment law in a very long time. Much of my work at the end of 2019, going into early 2020, was all about AB5. Questions that employers had about converting, what's the test, can I keep my folks as contractors? If I need to make them employees, what does that look like? And then obviously the pandemic hit and the employment law conversations shifted significantly in the last few months, but AB5 is still law, still went into effect. And while there have been so many changes for employers in the last few months, as businesses are starting to open up and bring folks back and hire, this is still something that they have to keep in mind because it is the law and folks need to comply with it. So what is AB5? So what AB5 did was codify in California statute a 2018 California Supreme Court case called Dynamex, Operations West, most commonly referred to as the Dynamex case. And that was a case in regards to truckers who were classified as independent contractors who sued and said, no, we're actually employees for a variety of reasons. And the California Supreme Court agreed with the truckers that, yes, you in fact are employees. And what it did was change the test that California employers have to use when determining whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. But it also expanded, the AB5 expanded that California Supreme Court case by saying this new test is applicable to a variety of statutes. So Dynamex was only about wage orders and using the new test when there were legal claims under the wage orders. But AB5 said, nope, you need to use this new test when under the labor code, under the unemployment insurance code, the workers' compensation code. And AB5 starts with the presumption that every worker who's performing services for remuneration is an employee. So that's the baseline. That is the assumption. And then from there, an employer can prove that no, our worker is not an employee, but they're an independent contractor because we can satisfy this new test called the ABC test. And I'm going to go over what the old test is, what the new test is. But the takeaway is that the ABC test is narrower. It's harder to classify workers now as independent contractors. All right. The old test was based on a case from years and years and years ago called Borrello. And in the Borrello test, there was a primary factor, which was that if a employer or a business, I should say, controls the manner and means in which a worker performs services. Control. It was control. So the primary factor was, does that entity have control over that worker? And then there were a bunch of secondary cases. And here's some of those secondary factors. Was the worker, did they have a distinct occupation or business? Were they working under the direction of the employer? What was the degree of skill required? So for that, if you're more junior versus having more expertise or specializations, if you were an expert or specialized, that would lean more towards being an independent contractor. Supplying instrumentalities, tools, place of work, that was if the worker was supplying their own things, that leaned towards independent contractor. Length of time of services to be performed, was it a discrete project or was it ongoing work? If it was a discrete project, it leaned towards being independent contractor. Method of payment, was the work part of the regular business? Was there a written agreement? So these were some of the secondary factors. And under the old Borello test, while there was primary emphasis on this first factor about control, then there were all these secondary factors. It really was a totality of the circumstance analysis, which means let's look at all of this and figure out whether this worker was an independent contractor or an employee. And I'll be honest with you, this test is even hard to satisfy in many cases. So while there's a belief that AB5 definitely tightened things up, but it was actually quite hard under the law to also satisfy this old Borello test. So here comes the new test, okay? So this is the new test that came from first in Dynamex and then codified in AB5. And the ABC test is no longer a totality of the circumstance case. It is an and. You must satisfy, the business entity must show that they can satisfy all three of these components in order to show that a worker is in fact an independent contractor. So what is ABC? A worker is free from control and direction of the hirer as to performing the work, both under agreement and in fact. So this one is very similar to that primary factor I was just talking about in Borello. It's about control. Then there's B, worker performs work outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. That one I'm going to come back to because that one's really the game changer. And then C is worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade or business of the same nature performed for the hiring entity. So that's a lot of words to basically say that, does this worker have their own business? Okay, their own established business. So let's go into detail about these three. And again, please note that this is an and test, not an or test. And must do all three. All right. So here is more about each one of them. So talking about A, free of control. Like I mentioned, this is very similar to that primary factor in Borello. Does the entity exert control, but also do they retain the right to exert control? And control can come in so many ways. Control is, are you telling them how to perform work, when to perform work, where to perform work? Are you requiring them to report what they are doing? The courts have said that one very strong indicator of control is, does the hiring entity have the right to unilaterally terminate the worker? So there's a lot of different ways that control can be shown. In AB5, they specifically talk about how there's control in practice and how you actually interact with this worker, but also contractually. That has to do with the independent contractor agreement. I see a lot of independent contractor agreements that have a lot of language in there that indicates control. So for this test, if it was ever challenged, there was a legal claim, the courts would look at both what is your actual relationship, is there control, but also what does your independent contractor agreement say? All right, so B is the one that I said has really been the game changer and really the one that's the most difficult to satisfy for businesses. So this is outside. Does the worker perform services that are outside the usual course of the business? So the question you ask there is the worker providing services that are integral to what the business does? Okay, so if you think about that one, if I am, for example, a tutoring company, and I have all these independent contractors who are tutors, is the tutor integral to what that business does? If I have a business that is a newspaper, and I have all these journalists who are independent contractors, are those journalists integral to what that company does? And the answer is yes. And in a lot of situations, when a business has an independent contractor, that they are doing work that is integral to what the business does. Specifically, in the Dynamex case, the court pointed out that one way that you can also assess this is, do you have an independent contractor doing the same work as an employee? Okay. And then the example that was given in the Dynamex case was when a retail store hires an outside plumber to repair a leak in a bathroom on its premises. Is that person integral to what that business does? No, right? So imagine you have a retail store that's selling clothes and you have a toilet leak and you bring in this outside plumber who comes in with their own tools and their expertise and they fix that toilet. Is that plumber doing something integral to selling of clothes, which is what the business does? And the answer is no. And then the last one, C, independent business, is has that worker taken steps to establish and promote themselves as an independent business? This can be evidenced by the independent contractor actually incorporating or having a business license or having a website's presence or advertising themselves in different ways. There's a variety of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean, okay, I now have to go become a C Corp, but you have to be able to show that you are an independent business in some way. And another thing that the court had said, the Dynamex court had said in looking at C was that that independent contractor must be performing services for other businesses, that you can't just, if you are exclusively working for one particular business as an independent contractor, that is counter to them being an independent contractor. Because in their mind, if you are an independent contractor, you are performing you're performing services for a variety of businesses. Okay, so that is ABC in a nutshell. Now, AB5 had a bunch of exemptions. Now, I want to be really clear about the exemptions. It does not mean that if you fall into one of these professions that I'm going to talk about, that no test applies and that you can be an independent contractor, no problem. That's not what it means. What the exemptions are saying, and they're categorized in different ways, is that the ABC test does not apply, but other tests do. And typically what it's going to be is Borello, that old test I was mentioning, that test will apply. And there are additional factors that are laid out in AB5 for some of these categories. So let's just take an example. One of the exemptions, specific licensed occupations, okay? These are like California licensed occupations. physicians, surgeons, lawyers, accountants, investment advisors, direct salesperson, and commercial fishermen. These are specific licensed occupations. And what that means is that, again, not that you're one of these, no worries, do whatever you want. It means that you still have to satisfy the Borello test. Move this here, sorry. You still have to satisfy the Borello test. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's not that easy to satisfy either, right? You still have to show that this entity is not exerting control over you and that you are able to satisfy a bunch of those secondary factors. But if you're able to do that, then you can use that old test, which is easier than ABC test. Okay, here's another one, professional exemptions. And I'm not listing all of them, here's some of them. Marketing professional, travel agent, graphic designer, grant writer, fine artist, and photographers and journalists who submit only 35 submissions to a particular place. So for this one, what AB5 said was you can use the Borello test, but before you use the Borello test, you actually have to satisfy 6 separate factors. And so, for example, those 6 factors are maintain a business location separate from the hiring firm. It can be a home office. Have a business license. Be able to set or negotiate your own rates for the services performed. Be able to set your own hours. Be customarily engaged in the same type of work under contract with another hiring firm, or hold themselves out to other potential customers. Customarily and regularly exercise discretion and independent judgment performing services. So if you are in one of these industries and you don't want to, the argument is ABC test does not apply to me, you would first have to satisfy these 6 factors. If you're able to satisfy these 6 factors, then you move on to the Borello test and make sure that you can satisfy the Borello test. Okay. Another one is the business-to-business exemption. And for this one, there are 12 different factors that that needs to be satisfied. And once that's satisfied, then you go to the Borello test. There was hope that this business-to-business exemption was going to be quite broad and allow basically, if I'm an established business, I can then contract with another business. But it's actually one of the most narrow exemptions because it specifically says that the services that are being performed by that contractor cannot be for the other business's customers or clients. So if I take that tutoring example again, if a tutor is an independent contractor and they're working for this entity, who are they performing services for? That entity's clients or customers, right? So this business-to-business exemption wouldn't work for them. It would work though in that other example I'd given about the plumber who came in for the retail business and fixed their toilet, because those are 2 different businesses. There's a bunch more exemptions in AB5, cosmetology, construction subcontractors, real estate licensees, business that obtain work through referral agencies. And there's, again, different factors for these. I don't have time to go through them, but they exist. All right, so what happens if you have classified, a business has classified a worker as an independent contractor, and someone out there, whether it's the government or that individual worker, thinks, no, you misclassified me, I should be an employee. There's a few different consequences. First, it can come from the government in the context of audits. At the federal level, there's IRS audits, there's Department of Labor audits. In California, there's EDD audits. I know most about those because I represent companies that are being audited by the EDD for misclassification. And when this happens, the EDD will look at 3 years worth of your independent contractors, 3 years back of your independent contractors, and assess whether they were misclassified or not. If they were misclassified, then there are back taxes, interest, penalties, and fines. There's a variety of really expensive consequences if the EDD finds that you have misclassified. Then there is lawsuits. This can come from an individual. This can be a class action. This could be something called, in California, we have this thing called a PAGA claim, which is somewhat similar to a class action. It is a representative action where one person can say, I represent all these employees, and we've all been, our rights have been violated in similar ways. And so if there is a lawsuit by an individual who says, I've been misclassified as an independent contractor, I in fact should have been an employee, what you typically will see is claims of not getting paid appropriate wages, not getting paid overtime, not getting meal and rest breaks. There's also attorney fees, which means that if a business is sued, that person who's suing you, their attorney, you may be on the hook for paying their attorney's fees if you do not prevail. There's different penalties, there's liquidated damages. So again, like any lawsuit, there's a lot of potential claims and liabilities. Now, AB5 introduced additional consequences for misclassification. They have said, the bill says that violation of AB5 itself can create criminal charges. It referenced the fact that misclassifying workers as an independent contractor can trigger criminal charges. We have not seen this play out yet. So what that means, whether it's some sort of penalty or even jail time, but we will eventually see this. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be against like repeat offenders as opposed to a one-time thing. Also, what AB5 has allows is the California Attorney General and certain city attorneys to be empowered to pursue injunctions against businesses that are suspected of misclassifying workers. And what an injunction would be is the attorney general or city attorney going into court saying, this company is violating AB5, you need to tell them to stop doing that right away. And you may have heard in the news just on May 5th, so a few weeks ago, California Attorney General sued Uber and Lyft for violating AB5. So this is the first case that I know of in California where the Attorney General is stepping in with their new powers and are suing these two companies who still have not converted all of their drivers into employees. And so they are bringing this case saying, okay, they're in violation of AB5 as they continue to still classify their drivers as independent contractors. So we're watching, let's see what happens. All right, I only have a few more minutes here, but I just wanted to point out that in the last few months, there have been some of the COVID-19 legislation that has come out has touched on independent contractors, which may have the eventual impact of triggering some audits by, let's say for the EDD, for example. So just for example, the first one here is the federal pandemic unemployment compensation. So as you know, under the federal law is allowing independent contractors for the first time to apply for unemployment benefits. If you're in California, you're doing that process through the EDD. And so in the course of doing this, these independent contractors will be stating their sources of business, including through the entities that have been paying them as independent contractors. And this has the potential of triggering audits if the EDD sees this and thinks that they were misclassified. I just also point out that there's also been these federal laws on extended paid sick leave that have come out. And there's certain cities, San Francisco and San Jose, which made their own versions of that and are allowing it to apply to independent contractors working in their cities. And then just one thing also I'll point out, just because I've been asked this from others, is there may be some businesses out there who have applied for the PPP loan. As you know, there's a loan forgiveness part to that. And you need to get your payroll to a certain extent and your headcount to a certain extent. You need to do that with W-2 employees. It specifically says that hiring of in compensating independent contractors is not a forgivable expense. Future of AB5, just where we're moving. I won't go into a lot of details. There are areas of litigation going on right now. California Supreme Court has agreed to look at one provision of AB5, which said that it was retroactive, which means that you used the old test, let's say 3 years ago. Can someone sue you today for what you did 3 years ago? Right now, AB5 does have retroactive language in it that says that you can. This has been challenged and the California Supreme Court has agreed to look at this. Then there's that case I just mentioned about California. And then there's a bunch of proposed statutes in the California legislature right now by industry to become a new exemption. As I mentioned, all those exemptions, there are a whole bunch of, this is not even the list. There are so many additional proposed statutes out there to give different industries an exemption. And then the takeaway here is that regardless of what is proposed or what may happen in the future, and maybe the industry you are in will get an exemption, but currently today, AB5 is the law and it is most likely going to stay that way. There are a few other statutes out there pending that would change ABC test. I don't really see those passing, but they're out there. But for today, my advice is to comply, to figure out if you have independent contractors, are they properly classified? If they're not, what does it look like to make them employees? And then that's it, but I went my whole half an hour. Pauline, are there questions? Do we have time?
Oh, sure, but there are no questions in the chat box. Does anyone have a question? You can quickly unmute and ask Shivani your question.
Do you plan to send the recording of this seminar?
Yes, it's being recorded.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? No? If not, thank you so much, Shivani.
All right, thank you.